Hey everybody, it's Alex here, and I wanted to do a little preliminary video for you since I think our class time itself will be taken up with plenty of other discussion, but I wanted to cover some content for the first day in particular, just to get some concepts out there and start thinking about what we're doing in this class on research in comparative international education, specifically looking at the more quantitative side of things. Our first session is going to broadly cover the aims, theories, and models of comparative education, which you probably saw from the syllabus. Anyway, so we're not going to cover all of that in this video, but I did want to go over some of the key issues and maybe jumpstart our conversation. Let's think of it that way. So let me just start out by talking a little bit about the purposes of comparative quantitative research. Largely speaking, we're really trying to test hypotheses. Now, I'm jumping a little ahead here and assuming that you have some knowledge of quantitative research, probably that you've gotten from previous courses that you've taken, or in particular the EDUC 403 or basic research class. And I want to make it clear that, there's a lot that goes on before this, but when we get to the methods, the quantitative methods in particular, we're usually testing a set of hypotheses that comes directly from the lit review and the theoretical framework that attempts to make some sort of a statement about what you think is happening based on the question that you're asking. So a hypothesis is a statement stipulated within a given theory about the relationship between variables, which we're going to call constructs. So constructs means a relationship between variables, defined by way of some objects, which we're calling the units of observation, within a causal framework, which we're going to basically talk about time, space, that sort of thing. So in comparative education research, hypotheses deal with comparisons across space, or we'll also use the word location, or time. So we're comparing from country to country, we're on space now, right? Country to country, or district to district, or school to school, or student to student, or whatever it is, or all of those at once. Or we're comparing across different units of time. Those can be cross-sectional, like you have with the large studies, 1999, and then another one in 2003, and then another one in 2007, that's a 3, and then another one in 2011. This, by the way, is the TIM cycle, for those of you who are following along at home. Or it could be, like we said before, between country 1 and country 2, sorry, there's a 2, or between many different schools that it might be within a district, or across districts which might have more than one school in them, and so you're looking at the differences both between the districts as well as within the districts. So, there are lots of ways that we can compare, and we'll talk more about that in a second, but I want to make it clear right off the bat that we're really talking about hypothesis testing. And when it all boils down, and I hate to be too reductionist, but we are going to be talking about hypothesis testing as a way to push our quantitative comparative research methods forward. So as I mentioned before, there are a couple of typical ways that we compare quantitative data around education, and those two typical ones are location and time. So there used to be, it's not around, it's got a different name now, but there used to be a thing called cross-time, cross-space. It was a project that was started by the National Center for Educational Statistics here in the United States, and also a group called the American Institutes for Research. And it literally stood for, it's XTXS, but it was cross-time, cross-space. So cross-time, cross-space, that was the whole point of it. And thinking about the different kinds of quantitative data that could be used to compare education across different time periods or time units, and then across space or location. So as I pointed out on the last slide with all my crazy doodles down here at the bottom, when we talk about going across space and location, we're usually probably more than we should be, talking about nations, defined either as states or countries or societies or systems. And we're using those as our units of observation or units of analysis. And then usually if we're doing this and we're doing many at the same time, so I mentioned we could have a country level, we could have a region level, we could have a, my handwriting's horrible, district level, and we could have a school level, and we could have a classroom level, and we could have a student level, right? The individual. I mean, there are lots of different levels that we could go to that indicate some sort of spatial or location-bound difference. Although I guess individual is kind of funny to say as a location, but you get what I'm saying. But usually there's at least one variable that's defined on the national level, the country or society or something like that. In comparative quantitative research, it's just very typical. I'm not saying it's required, but it's very typical to have that. And then you could have all these others either nested within there or do them separately in terms of comparative approach. For time, I gave some example, or I gave an example on the last slide for the TIMS cycle. Actually, the TIMS itself started in 1995, and then has been every 4 years since then. So 95, 99, 2003, 2007, 2011, 2015, there'll be another one in 2019, and on it goes. PISA is on a similar cycle, except instead of every 4 years, it's every 3 years. And so when we talk about those kinds of studies, we're talking about cross-sectional or cross-section studies. I usually say cross-sectional. I don't know why it says cross-section here. Cross-sectional studies literally do split it so that you've got 1995, 99, 2003, 2007, 2011, 2015, 2019, 2023, etc. And at each of these time periods you have maybe the same countries are involved in each of these levels or across these different levels, but you'll probably have different students or different teachers in classrooms or different schools that are participating, and that's why they're called cross-sectional, is because they're not longitudinal, meaning that they don't have the same schools, classrooms, and students necessarily in each of the cycle data collection what am I trying to say? In each of the cycles of data collection, they don't have the same units of observation or space location units in them, but they do maybe share the country across each. Whereas in longitudinal, you have a case or an individual or somebody that goes through all of these different ones. So you might have, I don't know, a student named Alex. And Alex would participate in the 1995, 99, 2003. You get the point. Every one of these you'd be tracking Alex for some reason. And so the thread of Alex comes through at each of these moments in time when you collect data. In this case, you would have the same one of these units in each of the cycles of data collection. In this case with Alex, our student, what a great name by the way, we're talking about students being consistent across that time. So when we talk about comparative quantitative methods, we're usually comparing across space or location and or across time, sometimes all of the above, sometimes just one or the other. So, what's interesting about international comparative education, at least the stuff that we work on, most of the published educational research is within country and present time. That means that, actually, I'll go beyond comparative international education, and I'll just say education research. So, for example, I'm currently sitting in the United States. Most of the professional journals and other publications, quite frankly, in the world related to educational research come out of the United States, or at least out of the North American tradition, closely followed by European and other Western communities. And most of the stuff, I'll go back to the U.S., most of the stuff that's coming out of in educational research is within the United States, and it is roughly speaking at one time period, often current. And that seems to be the most popular method for educational research, broadly speaking. If I was sitting in Germany right now, then I would probably be looking mostly at Germany-related educational research that is set roughly in the contemporary time period. But comparative methods sort of take it a little further, and so we're a little more specific in that we address problems or phenomena that are measurable across and between space and across and between time, right? So we have this neat way of thinking about how we can compare what's happening across space and across time that is different than what you'd see in a lot of other educational research. Now, what's interesting about that, and why I kind of flubbed a little bit when I started talking about this line at first, is because most of the comparative international educational research that's produced is actually single country. Meaning that it will look at specifically Saudi Arabia or specifically France or something like that, but it will be done by a researcher who, for some reason, is not native to that region, or is presenting it to, it may be native to that region, but is presenting the research to people who are not. So if I, as an American, tried to publish something that was about U.S. education in a German academic publication, all of a sudden it becomes a comparative education research piece, which is odd and funny. And if you were in CIE 400 or the Introduction to Comparative International Education class with me at any point, you've had this discussion about what it means to be comparative and international in your research. But what's also interesting is that comparative education constitutes a paradigm. And a paradigm, as we've defined here, or as Ritzer has defined here, is a fundamental image of the subject matter within a science. It serves to define what should be studied, what questions should be asked, how they should be asked, and what rules should be followed in interpreting the answers obtained. So what we're actually doing right now in this class is going beyond just the conceptual and the theoretical, and we're trying to say, what is the methodological paradigm for comparing education across time and across space? So kudos to us for tackling, creating, or at least recognizing what the de facto paradigm is. Cool. I'm going to do a couple more things, and I'm going to stop because I'm doing these recordings in 15-minute intervals, partly because that's what's available for free using Screencast-O-Matic, and partly because that makes these a little more digestible, I think, when you're viewing them. So I just wanted to give you the warning that we've got a little less than 2 minutes left here. When we're thinking about comparative methods, we're asking usually a couple of key questions. We want to know what should be studied. We want to know what questions should be asked. We want to know how should the questions be asked, and we want to know what rules should be followed. So I'm just going to help us out here because we're talking about, in this half of the course, the quantitative comparative methods. So what should be studied? Well, I'm going to point to this. We want to study something that can be empirically measured using numbers or represented by quantitative data in some way. That doesn't mean that we dictate what we study based on our methods. That means that the methods, and I wish I could erase that. There probably is a way to do that. The methods are going to maybe arise because we've asked questions that can be studied using those quantitative methods. So when we ask our questions, we're going to be asking questions that can be measured discretely, meaning that there is a very specific way that we will be able to define and measure the items or the issues or the problems or the constructs that are mentioned in our questions. And we're going to ask the questions in a way that they can be converted to hypotheses. I remember what hypotheses are from the previous slide. And so we'll use the rules of quantitative methodology, broadly speaking, in order to approach our comparative methods. I'm going to pause here and I'm going to come back in part 2 for our session 1 discussion to talk a little bit more about comparative methods.